Hi, and welcome to this presentation, How We Built It, Office Visits with ArcGIS Indoors and Power Automate. My name is Nate Bennett, and I'm a technical consultant in Esri's Professional Services Division. Today, I'd like to share with you a look at a really interesting system we built internally at Esri recently. This office visit system provided a way for Esri staff to request to temporarily work from the office in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. This system uses ArcGIS Indoors for smart building management, as well as Microsoft Office 365's productivity and automation tools. Before we dive into the tech, though, let's lay a little bit of context. There was, of course, a time where a lot of us were working from the office, but in the midst of COVID-19, Esri, like everyone else, was learning to transition to a virtual working from home environment. Now, even as we made that transition, there were still numerous cases that would come up and still do come up where staff needed to visit the physical office. These ranged from needing to access secure systems and workflows to trying to avoid all the different flavors of home office complications. The situations that arise that make it very difficult, if not impossible, for staff to meet tough deadlines and the expectations of customers. Luckily for Esri, though, we already had a leg up with an existing deployment of ArcGIS Indoors that we were using for managing our interior spaces and our campuses across the US and the world. Now, if you're not familiar, ArcGIS Indoors is a complete indoor mapping system for smart building management. It organizes operational data sets into floor-aware indoor maps to support facilities, workplace operations, and maintenance use cases. Executives, supervisors, field staff, and employees can better understand, maintain, and operate their workplace environment with ArcGIS Indoors. Now, from an architectural perspective, ArcGIS Indoors is built on ArcGIS, and deployments can be on premises with ArcGIS Enterprise or hosted in the cloud with ArcGIS Online. Both draw from an underlying Indoors information model that's developed using a focused extension for ArcGIS Pro. Out of the box, Indoors provides client-facing apps focused on workflows like space planning, a web-based viewer or kiosk app to allow people to navigate, as well as native mobile apps for iOS and Android that can also take advantage of an existing deployed indoor positioning system, which provides very high accuracy while navigating indoors. But as we started to better understand the requirements for a system to allow staff to request to work from the office, we realized that there were a couple of complications and challenges that would require us to branch outside of just what we get with ArcGIS Indoors out of the box. For one, there's a multi-level approval process required. So for any Esri staff that need to visit the office, approvals are required from their specific department manager, from our division director, as well as corporate. There's also quite a few very important operational workflows that need to be coordinated in sequence with the request, such as deep cleaning of office space. And finally, there's also a geographic dimension that's very important. We really wanted to take social distancing into account, and for each request, we wanted to know upfront how many other staff were going to be in the same building, the same floor, the same wing, and with a certain proximity of the requester's office. Now, because ArcGIS Indoors is built on ArcGIS, we're able to leverage open APIs to integrate with third-party systems and data. With this, we were able to integrate ArcGIS Indoors with Microsoft Office 365 using standard HTTP web requests that leverage the underlying ArcGIS REST API. So let's take a look at what the return to office system looks like from an end user perspective. So the first step in requesting to work from the office is for an Esri staff member to fill out this form. This is a very simple internal Microsoft form that allows Esri staff members to provide their justification for their visit, as well as additional context and logistical information that goes along with the request. Now, when this form is submitted, it's automatically routed to the employee's department manager for approval. Now, in the case of this demonstration, I've configured myself to be the approver at every level. Let's jump over into Outlook, and we can see that first department manager approval show up in my inbox. All right, so there we can see the department manager approval. And this is actually a Microsoft approval sent from Power Automate. You can think of these approvals as sort of a service for managing approval workflows that's really tightly integrated into Microsoft communication clients like Outlook and Teams. There's interactive buttons that you can click from right inside the clients. There's the ability to reassign to other approvers. And as approvals are made by one approval, the status is automatically reflected for the rest of them. Now for this approval, we can begin to see some of the context and information that we supplied in that initial form. And we also have a link here to an office approval request map. So this app is a configuration of ArcGIS Web App Builder with a couple of custom widgets. And those custom widgets make this app not only floor aware, but it also allows it to be time aware and automatically showing the request for the given time period, in this case, February 9th. So the app is automatically centered on my office, and I can see my request in the context of what's going on in the rest of the building on campus. Now, if we take a look back in email and look at that approval, we can see the details from the form, as well as some other really interesting analysis here. At the bottom of this request, we can see some of that social distancing information we talked about earlier. And we can see the number of employees in the same building, floor, wing, and within a 30-foot buffer of my office. Now, in this case, I'm going to approve and send this request up the approval chain to the division manager. And as I make that approval request, if we jump back to our web app and refresh a little bit, we can see the request has changed status from submitted to approved and sent to the division manager. We take a look back at our email, we can see the second request has come in. Same details as long as the approval at level 1, which again is me. And I'm going to approve this again, send it to corporate, come back to the app, and see that the status has been updated. Look back in email, and we should see the corporate approval show up in just a second. There's the final corporate approval. Hit approve. Take a look at our application again. And there we can see the request has been approved by corporate. And then over in email, if we check our inbox, we can see that we've received, as the requester, final approval, as well as some other additional information for making sure that I'm following the COVID protocols that are in place. Now, finally, for our department managers, division directors, corporate folks in HR, we also have a Power BI dashboard that was configured to provide staff with insight into historic and active requests and allow them to slice and dice that information however they need to for their specific roles. All right, so that was a look at the system from an end user perspective. Now let's pull back the curtain and take a look at how the system actually functions. I think what's really interesting about the system is, outside of filling out a form, the only human interaction required is managers and operational staff clicking approval buttons in their email. Now, in terms of the components of the system, Microsoft Power Automate plays a really big role in handling not only the workflow orchestration and serving up the approvals, but also in making the HTTP web requests that are required for keeping ArcGIS Indoors in sync with the Microsoft Office 365 system. And that's done by leveraging very standard web requests that take advantage of the ArcGIS REST API. Now, in terms of the system, there are really 3 big integration points, or places where Office 365 and ArcGIS Indoors need to stay in sync. The first is when a new request is actually submitted. We need to get that data initially up into the ArcGIS Indoors system. Then we need to perform the social distancing analysis for that request. We need to see what other staff members are in the same building, floor, wing, and within a certain proximity of the office. And the final is updating the approval status at every level. Whether that approval has been approved or denied, we have to make sure that that status is reflected in the ArcGIS Indoors system. And because these are all leveraging secure content and services, we need to be able to authenticate into the ArcGIS Indoors system using an ArcGIS access token. So now let's return to the return to Office system, but let's focus in on the integration of what's happening behind the curtain. Here we are in Power Automate, which is the cloud automation service that's built into Office 365. In Power Automate, you build flows, which are the automation routines. There are inputs called triggers, and there are tools and processes called actions. They all have inputs and outputs that can be chained together. There's also a rich library of actions and triggers built around Office 365 and Microsoft productivity tools and workflows. Now, if you're familiar with Model Builder in ArcGIS Desktop, this kind of has a similar feel. It kind of is focused at similar users doing similar things. With Power Automate, you can chain together processes, creating an endless number of workflows without having to write any code. So let's take a look at what this flow is actually doing. First, we have a trigger whenever a new response is submitted, and then we go and grab all of the details and values from that response. And then here we've got a couple of variables that we're using to aid in the workflow farther on. One to help with crawling our org chart, helping us identify who the department manager is for the person who made the request. And then also another variable here focused on ArcGIS Indoors, both to hold values that we'll need later on as the output of our analysis for social distance checking, and then another set for containing some variables we need to be able to authenticate and access Indoors. Then we have our first big block of work, and the scope in Power Automate is just a way to collect actions into a collapsible item here. So what we're doing here is we're doing a little bit of kind of back-end setup, and then we're crawling the org chart. We're taking the submitter and then finding their manager and finding their manager's manager until we make it all the way up the org chart. And that allows us to identify who the department manager is. And we define department manager as someone in the reporting chain who reports to the division director. So in our world, that's 3 levels down from the top of the org chart. Once we get there and we identify who the department manager is, we can go and grab all of their profile information that we'll use in the rest of the workflow. So first we add that item to a list in SharePoint. What we're doing is taking results from the submitted form as well as the Microsoft Office profile data for both the person submitting the form and the department manager, cleaning up some of those values and putting it all in one place. And this SharePoint list for the request that we just watched make its way up the approval chain is what's actually feeding the Power BI dashboard that we saw earlier. So then the last part of this flow is really focused on the request workflow. Sending out those requests at each level and then processing the results. So let's take a closer look at that. So we've got a couple of big sections here where we're formatting some values, both doing a little bit of work with dates to make sure that we can show the right dates in ArcGIS Indoors, and then also formatting some of the values we need for the approvals and the emails and making sure everything is going to look good in whatever client a user is accessing to see that approval. Here we've got our first big piece of work and integration with ArcGIS Indoors. I'm going to come right back to that after we take a look at the rest of the flow. This is the approval action, and this is where we can configure the response options or the buttons that we saw in the email and the rest of the results from the form. Now again, this is where I assigned all of the approvals to myself, but in the real system, what we'd see here is the mail for my department manager, as well as the other folks in management and operations that need to be sort of watching these requests as they're submitted and being processed. Now, based on the outcome of this approval, a couple of different things can happen. First, what we do is we update that information both in the SharePoint list and then also in ArcGIS Indoors to make sure that all of the different clients are in sync. And then we're going to actually process the outcome of the approval. If the approval is not approved or denied, submitter receives communication indicating why that request has been denied. If approved, it moves up to the next level in the org chart. And it gets approved by the division manager. The rest of the approval workflow is essentially the same at every level. The outcome is updated in a SharePoint list, synchronized with ArcGIS Indoors, and then the result is processed. If rejected, communication is sent. If approved, it continues on to corporate, again updating SharePoint list and Indoors, and then finally, based on the outcome from corporate, either sending the approval email with the instructions or the denied email. So let's go back up and take a look at what we're doing with ArcGIS Indoors. All right, so here's our first scope for the integration with ArcGIS Indoors. And three things need to happen. We need to request that token from ArcGIS Indoors. We need to make the initial request, create it. And then finally, we need to perform that social distancing analysis so that we can have those details in that context to put in the approval and the subsequent emails. Now, to create a token from Power Automate, we just need to do two things. First, we need to make a web request to generate a token. And then we need to parse the results, parse the JSON response, and identify and pull out that access token string that we'll need to authenticate in all the rest of the communication that happens between Power Automate and Indoors. Now in Power Automate, there's this really handy action called a HTTP action. And this is a premium action that requires an elevated level of licensing. But what it does is it allows you to construct a low-level web request by configuring the standard parameters for an HTTP web request. We specify the method of that request, whether it's a GET or a POST or the other verbs. We can see the URI to our endpoint, and then we provide headers, query parameters for our URL or the actual body that gets sent up in a POST request. And we can just pull in the outputs from previous actions and mix that in with text to very easily construct our URL or to construct a request. Now in ArcGIS, there's a couple of different ways that you can authenticate and under the hood request a token. And to take a look at that, we take a look at the new ArcGIS developer site. We can navigate to our documentation, and below the focus doc for the different APIs and SDKs and products, there's an additional documentation section that has some really great content. And here's some focused on security and authentication. It really walks you through all of the different options. Now, for this particular system, because we're interacting with secure content and we're having really no human interaction, meaning there's no opportunity for a user to authenticate manually with OAuth or use a single sign-on, we're going to be using a non-OAuth 2.0 authentication pattern. And what this basically requires is that we're going to generate a token using the generate token endpoint, and we'll be passing up the username and password we need for the built-in user that we're leveraging. So if we take a look at the documentation and take a look at the ArcGIS REST API, under user groups and items, we can navigate to the authentication section and take a look at the generate token endpoint. And this goes through the request parameters and the response. But if we take a look at one of the examples, we can see the refer example. And this is the pattern that we're going to be using. We take a look at the request. We're going to be making a post request to the generate token endpoint. We'll be using form encoding, and you can see in the form encoded body, we've got the username, password, and a client refer URL, and then the expiration in the expiration for how long the token will actually last for, and the format. In this case, of course, we're making a request and we want the response in JSON so that we can process it. Now, if we take a look back at this HTTP action for the generate token, it's going to look exactly the same. At generate token endpoint, we're providing the content type and the body parameters. Now, what that's going to return is a JSON response that includes the access token, number of ticks until it expires, and a flag for whether SSL is required. And in our flow, we take a look at the parse JSON action. We're passing in the body, and we're providing a schema. In this case, mirroring that example response where we're seeing the token, the expiration in an integer, and that SSL flag. Now, once we have that token in hand, we can start to we can use that to make the other requests we need for ArcGIS Indoors. So let's take a look at the create request. Again, we've got that same string of the HTTP request parsing the JSON, and then we're also doing a little bit of additional work here to grab the output from the apply edits request that we'll take a look at right now. So this is a little bit more complicated, but it's essentially the same. We're going to be using in the apply edits endpoint on a hosted feature service layer, and essentially all we're doing is adding a new feature to that layer. And the way we do that is by passing up JSON to represent that feature. So if we take a look at the endpoint here, we have a layer, which is the people layer, which is part of the Indoors information model. And it includes all of the Esri staff members and their individual offices. And then we also have a related table here, office approval requests. This table is essentially joined to the people layer based on employee email, and it contains all of the request details that are required to visualize that request in that web app builder configuration that we saw earlier, and also make sure that this information can be linked back to the data that is stored in SharePoint. So we've got the details of the request, and then we also have the special request ID. And this is the key that we can use to make sure that the request that was submitted through the form and being stored and updated in SharePoint is also reflected in ArcGIS Indoors. And because this is just a table with no geometry, all we need to do is pass up the attributes from our request. If we take a look at this apply edits action here, we're making a post to the apply edits endpoint, again passing up that content type, and then you can see the attributes. And you can see that this is really a mashup of all kinds of information, both from the Microsoft form as well as Office 365 profile information and some of the other values that we massage to make everything nice and clean. And then outside of the JSON for all of those attributes for that feature we're passing up, we're also just passing in the token from that previous generate token request and the format as JSON. And then based on those results, we're going to parse the results of the add, and what that will allow us to do is to be able to grab and store the object ID. That object ID is what we're going to use to make updates as the approval status changes. The last step of this initial integration is performing the social distance checker analysis. And this is actually pretty straightforward because what we've done on the back end is configure a hosted geoprocessing service. And for this geoprocessing service, we pass in a parameter for the request ID, which is again that primary key from the SharePoint data. And based on that request ID, in the background, that geoprocessing service is querying the Indoors information model and the requests that are valid for the given time period of that request, and pulling out the number of other staff members that are going to be in the same building, floor, wing, and then also within that, that proximity. And from a Power Automate perspective, all we need to do to make that request is pass up that request ID, as well as a token and a format. This is a very simple GET request, so really all we're doing is passing in some queries to go along with the URI. And then based on the results, we're going to parse the results from the social distance checker and then store those variables that we'll use in the approval details, so that management and operations can see those results and use them as they're making their decision. So the rest of the integration with Indoors is actually very similar to what we just saw. If we take a look at the outcome of the department manager approval, all we're doing is making an HTTP request that is essentially passing up the outcome of the approval, that approval status, and updating the status date, again with the valid token. So whether it's approved or denied, we're just passing that value up, and Indoors is reflecting that in the web app. You can see we're also using the object ID that we received when we made the initial create request. And then in the rest of the flow, at every step of the approval process, we're just doing the same thing, making the HTTP web request to apply the edits, and in this case making that update versus an add, passing up those new values for department, division, and then finally for corporate. And that is all we need to do to keep these two systems in sync. Now in Power Automate, you can also create your own custom actions and triggers through creating what's called a custom connector. With a custom connector, really all you're doing is specifying web service requests and responses, just like you would in an HTTP request action. Here you can see the three actions that we use for the system, and there's a UI you can use here to configure, as well as an underlying Swagger editor for really dialing in how an API or a web service is going to work inside of Power Automate. One of the interesting things you can do is you can specify default values and hide them from end users, making life a little bit easier. In this sample flow, if I navigate to the custom section and take a look at the Office Visits Dev Summit 21 custom connector, we can see the three actions here. From an end user perspective, life gets a whole lot easier. Generate token has absolutely no inputs because everything is hidden on the back end. And for something like apply edits, all we have to do is pass the token from generate token and specify the adds array of features. Nothing else to define, and it makes things a whole lot easier. So that was a look at the return to Office system from the back end and the integration between the two environments using HTTP web requests and the ArcGIS REST API. In closing, here's some key resources to learn more about ArcGIS Indoors, ArcGIS Developers, and Power Automate. There's also a really cool integration that's worth checking out between ArcGIS Indoors and ServiceNow, which is a cloud-based IT service management system for managing things like projects and tickets and incidents and requests. There's some really interesting integration components there that's worth a look. Thank you for joining me in this presentation, and please provide your feedback for the session by clicking on the session survey link directly below the video.